Exile is nothing new. You've already learned about it this week as you've gotten to know our guy Haggai. And the Jews, you remember, they were in exile because Jerusalem was sacked, the temple was destroyed, they were in exile in Babylon, so it's nothing new to them. That's their backstory, right? But here's the thing. It might be your right now story, because we have all had seasons of exile. When the Jews were in exile, they said that they could not sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land. And that's exactly what exile is. It's a foreign land. It's a place in our lives that feels foreign to us. We feel separated. We feel disenfranchised. When the Jews were in exile, they didn't have their temple. They didn't have their life that they had once known. They felt far removed. They were not any longer living within the promised land. And that's kind of what exile feels like for us. That we're far removed, we're isolated, we're just not in that promised land that we expected to be living in. And it comes in certain fashions for us, different ways, in different seasons of our lives. Sometimes the exile we feel is geographical. You know, literally, like you are removed from a place that was familiar to you and you are transplanted into a new place. And some of you right now might be in a new city, in a new town, and you know exactly what I'm talking about because you feel like you're in exile. You look around and you're like, where are my people? Because you haven't found your people yet. But if you're in a Bible study, that means you are finding your people. So way to go. But I remember for us being in a sort of exile once when we moved. Phil and I had only been married for a few years, and we moved several times because Phil was getting his doctorate degree. He's a professor, so we moved for him to get his education, and then we moved where the jobs went. You know how it goes. It's everyone's story. We moved a lot. So I'll never forget this one town where we moved, and we had been visiting churches trying to find a place for us to fit in. And we just hadn't found our place yet. And so we visited this particular church, and we loved it. I mean, the pastor, the teaching, the worship, it was wonderful. But we just didn't feel right at home. So we kept visiting. And so finally we decided, well, let's just visit a small group. Because if we visit a small group, a Sunday school class, you know, that'll help us find our people. We won't feel like we're in exile. So here we were. We finally found this Sunday school class. And we're walking in. Evidently they had started a little earlier than it said it would in the bulletin. So when we arrived a little late, we come in the back of the room. And there's somebody up at the front giving announcements, and then everybody else's eyes are on him. And Phil looks around and he's hesitating. And of course, because I can't see, I'm not sure what's happening. And I realize we're standing there a little too long to feel comfortable. And then Phil says to me, I'll be right back. And I think, what am I doing in this classroom with people who aren't talking to me? And where are you going? And then he comes back with 2 folding chairs. And he set them up for us, and we made our own back row. And that was a moment I felt like I was in exile. Because I was like, these are not my people. We felt so alone, so isolated. We had lived in bigger cities, and in bigger cities, people are so transient that they're used to just grabbing you, hugging you, and become your family within 5 minutes, right? Because you're all alone. Well, this wasn't that kind of town, so, you know, it's okay. But it helped me understand how sometimes when we move to a new place, we can feel totally like we are in exile. But sometimes the exile that we feel is physical. Some of you know what I'm talking about. It's when something happens to us physically. Maybe we get sick, or maybe we have a disability. I know sometimes blindness is like that for me. It feels so isolating. I can't see what's going on around me. You know, sometimes I'll be standing with a group of people and all of a sudden there's this collective laughter and I have no idea what has happened because it was all visual. It can feel like exile. It's isolating. Sometimes it's those invisible things like depression or anxiety that no one can see from the outside that makes you feel totally alone, like you're in this foreign land of fear where nobody enters in. I had a dear friend. She was a pastor's wife in this particular town where we lived. Her name was Gina. And she was like just a sweet mentor to me. Gina got cancer. And that woman fought with such grace and tenacity. And I remember near the end of her battle, she was in the hospital. We had lived in a different town at that point, so we drove all the way to this hospital to go see her, hours and hours and hours away. And I remember sitting by Gina, by her bed, and I had brought some lotion, and I was rubbing the lotion on her hand. And as I was rubbing lotion on her hand, it was so bony, so tiny and frail. And she said something to me I've never forgotten. She said, if I had really understood what cancer was like, if I had really understood how much it felt like exile, I would have entered into it with people. Exile. Some of you knows what it feels like to be in a physical kind of exile. But then there's that exile that shows up in our relationships or lack thereof, right? I mean, sometimes it might be that you've been married for years and years and years, and that man you love, he went to heaven. And you thought you were going to go first, but he did. And now you're in this place of widowhood, and it's an exile. It's a foreign land that you just feel so alone in. Or maybe it's that man who you said, I do to, he said, I don't anymore. And he found someone else. And you never thought you were going to be a single mom. And it feels like exile. Or it could be that you've been hanging with your girlfriends for years, and y'all did everything together, and then they start getting married, one after another, and all of a sudden you're the only one left, and they're doing stuff with their husbands, and you are in this singlehood exile. We all feel it for different reasons. I think one of the hardest is when you're actually in a relationship, perhaps a marriage, where there's no empathy or love. And it's a really hard kind of exile. We've all been in those seasons. We've all been in those situations. And there are different reasons and different times of exile, but what they have in common is that they're hard. And they're hard to get through. But there is purpose in exile. And in fact, there are some practices of women who are in exile that I'm going to share with you tonight. But before I share with you those practices of a woman in exile, I want you to understand what some of the purposes might be. You see, sometimes the purpose of exile is that God is allowing it to happen to discipline us. Sometimes it might even be punishment. In fact, that's what happened with the Jews. Because they had not obeyed the Lord, Jeremiah predicted that they would be in exile, that the Lord would use the Babylonians as part of his discipline for them. And it would be just the fruit of their disobedience. That's a hard truth, but y'all, sometimes that's the case. Sometimes we find ourselves in exile, and it's because we paved the way to get there. We planted the seeds, and then they grew. But the beautiful thing is that God will use even exile to discipline us. And it is not to harm us, it is to discipline us. That's what Hebrews chapter 12 tells us. That even though no discipline feels good, it's hard. It's hard for a season. But God will use it to produce within you this harvest of righteousness and peace when you are trained by it. You see, if you find yourself in exile and you can trace back and realize, oh man, I'm here because I planted these seeds and they grew, then just allow it to be a place where God can discipline you and train you so that you can begin to develop and be nourished by this great harvest of righteousness and peace. But another reason for exile could be pruning. Pruning. Now, I am not a gardener. I grew up in the city. I don't even keep houseplants, okay? So I'm really very unqualified to speak about this, but my mother is a master gardener, and she has the most beautiful garden. And the reason she has such a beautiful garden is because she is constantly pruning everything in that garden. Because you see, there are these branches that can grow at the bottom of a tree, and they're called suckers. And they suck all the nutrients, right? They suck all the water, they suck all the nutrients, they take all the nourishment, and what happens is the tree can't grow unless the suckers are removed. So you've got to constantly remove those suckers. And what I have read about these suckers is that if you don't get them off while they're young, if you let them stay there too long, then when you finally do try to remove them, it will actually wound the tree even more. I think sometimes God lets us be in exile to remove the suckers. Because there may be some things in your life that have been sucking the life out of you. They've been stealing your joy. They've been pulling all your energy, and you cannot grow there. And so God lovingly allows you to be in exile, to prune, to cut away those things that are taking your life away from you. So that's you. You do not need to be discouraged. You need to just say, see ya, suckers. And just enjoy that time of exile and allow it to be that which prunes you. But there's a third purpose, I believe, for exile. And it's that God proves us in exile. He proves us. I have a nail tech. She's my friend because she's been doing my nails for so long. If you don't like each other after 10 years every 2 weeks, you know, you got a problem. So Kim is my dear friend, and she does my nails, and we talk about everything in life. And so there was this one particular situation that we were talking about that we had in common, and it was just this difficult, stressful situation that involved some people and not knowing exactly what to do and how to behave, you know, those kind of things. And so Kim, as she's doing my nails, she says, do you just think God is testing us? And I said, actually, I think God is proving us. And there's a difference. You see, this stool, when I sit on it, I'm not trying to test it to see if it'll hold me up. When I sit on this stool, I'm doing it to prove that it will hold me up. You see, I believe that God allows us sometimes to be in exile to prove who we are, who we trust, who He is, and that He is faithful. It's not necessarily a test. Will we pass? Will we fail? No, it's an opportunity to prove what is true about God and what is true about you. And so if you're in exile, embrace the opportunity to experience this proving process. Because do you realize when God proves you and when He proves Himself faithful to you, it will improve everything about you? There is a purpose of exile. But even if you can embrace your purpose, that doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean that it's not hard to get through exile. So, what do? What do? I'm going to give you 3 practices of a woman in exile. And these 3 practices, they are based on a letter that Jeremiah the prophet wrote to the exiles. And this letter is in Jeremiah chapter 29. You see, in Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah is telling these exiles, here's what I want you to do while you're in exile. This is what God is instructing you to do. These are the practices that you should have in exile. So I'm going to give you 3 of them. And the first one is this. Participate with your exile. Participate with your exile. This is Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7. Jeremiah 29, 4 through 7. The Bible says that we are to build houses and live in them. We are to plant gardens and eat what they produce. And then the scripture says you are to take wives for yourselves. And then you are to have sons and you are to take wives for your sons. And then those people are supposed to, and you're just supposed to keep procreating is the point, okay? In other words, you multiply. You do not decrease, you increase. And then you seek the welfare of the city of your exile, and you pray for it because in its welfare is your welfare. See, God says if you're in exile, I don't want you to just go sit in the corner and wait till it ends. I want you to be all in. I want you to participate with your exile. And so those verses, they show us what kind of that looks like. Build something. I mean, that's what the Jews were told. Build houses and live in them. In other words, it may be temporary, but you can still be all in. So you build something. So if you're a woman in exile, what could you be building? Because exile is about construction, not destruction. So what could you build? Maybe could there be a habit you could build in exile? Maybe could there be the first building blocks of a ministry that you begin to build in exile? Maybe there's some relationships you build in exile. It's about constructing and growing and building. So what could you build in exile? Well, we're also told to plant gardens and eat what they produce. Now, clearly, they were supposed to take that literally. They were supposed to be self-sustaining. They were supposed to be nourished in exile. So are you. You're not supposed to starve to death in exile. But you get to participate in that. You get to plant something. Do you know what it means to plant? It means to set something in the ground for growth. Set it in the ground for growth. In other words, you got to get some seeds and you got to plant them. They might be seeds of faith that you plant. They might be seeds of a new hobby that you plant. But it's about doing something that nourishes your soul. Because that's the point of planting, so that you can be nourished by that which is produced during exile. So what is it that you can plant during exile? The Jews were also told that they were to take husbands and have babies, and have those babies have babies, and take wives for those babies so they can have babies. Okay, the point is multiply. The point is increase in relationship. How can you increase in relationship if you're in exile? I can tell you how. There's some other women who are in exile also, and they need you. They need you. You and I, when we're in exile, sometimes we have this tendency to isolate. I know with this broken wrist, when it just wouldn't get better and it kept being so debilitating, and that I couldn't dress myself, I couldn't prepare food, I couldn't do anything, I began to isolate because I felt like such a burden. And I was so discouraged. And I thought, who wants to be around me? I'm like Eeyore on steroids right now. I isolated. And we tend to do that in exile. But we have an opportunity in exile to increase in relationships. Now that doesn't mean necessarily that you need to make a bunch of friends, but you can increase in authenticity in your relationships. I learned to do that. You can learn to increase in the way that you love people, in your capacity to relate to people. And the last part of that verse 7, tells us that we are to seek the welfare, right, of our exile. So do you know what that means for you? It means that you seek the good in your exile. Now here's the point. It doesn't feel well and it doesn't feel fair. So we just have to get over that part. But we can seek the welfare. What is it that God has allowed this for in our lives? Because as we seek welfare within our exile, then we will experience welfare, right? So participate with your exile. Second practice of a woman in exile is that she pursues God in her exile. That's what you do when you're in exile. You pursue God. And this is based on Jeremiah 29, verses 8 and 9. Do not let the prophets and diviners deceive you, because I have not sent them. They do not prophesy in my name. It's lies. I believe that God was so generous to his people when he gave this command because it acknowledges that you and I, when we're in exile, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable. We're ready to fall for anything in exile because exile is hard. And the only way that you are protected from the lies that could entrap you within exile is to know the truth. And that's why you pursue God in exile. Now, sometimes when we're in exile, whatever it is, I don't know about you, but I want to become an exile expert. I'm going to Google everything there is to know about my exile. I'm going to watch YouTube videos. I'm going to join, and if I can't join one, I'm going to create a Facebook group for all of my fellow exiles. And not that any of that is bad, but that is not a substitute for pursuing God and pursuing truth in exile. Because if you do not know truth, you will not recognize a lie. So we pursue God in exile. And then we don't fall for the false prophets and the false hope that they can grant. So pursue God. In fact, Philippians 3 tells us our goal of exile. Philippians 3 says that we are to know Christ in the fellowship of his sufferings and in the power of his resurrection. That's what we want to do in exile, is pursue God and know him better. Third practice of a woman in exile is that she is patient with her exile. Tell y'all didn't like that very much. None of us do. I have learned with this risk that I am a very impatient patient. Patience is hard. And here's the thing, exile, it has a very long shelf life. Sometimes it feels like it just goes on and on and on. And don't you know, for the Jews, that's how they felt? I mean, here they're reading this letter, and it's saying, okay, I want you to marry, and then I want you to get your kids married, and then I want them to have kids, and I want your kids to marry. And they're thinking, how long is this going to last? It's decade after decade. Exile has a long shelf life, but it does have an expiration date. And that's why we choose to be patient with our exile. My daddy was sick for many years, and the longer he was sick, the more frail he became. And he didn't seem to have the stature that he used to have, though he never lost it on the inside. He was a giant. But I remember one day we were at the beach, and this did not happen often, so it was just such a special, special moment. And here was my daddy in so much pain, so frail, and he wanted to walk down to the ocean. And so I was with him, and I'm holding on to him, and I've got my cane, and he's got his walker. Not sure who's helping who. But as I'm walking with my dad, and I've seen what he's endured, and I've watched his spirit so undaunted no matter what he faced. I asked him, how do you do it when this lasts so long? And he said, well, you got to be patient with yourself. You got to be patient with the process. And you got to be patient with God. And that's hard. And some of you, it might be that you need to show a little patience towards yourself in exile. Some of you might need to show a little more patience with the process of exile. And I beg you to show patience with God in exile. Because he promises that exile will end. That's what Jeremiah 29, verse 10 tells us. That when 70 years is up, I'm going to come get you. And I'm going to take you back home to this place. You see, the Jews knew that this might last a while, and they didn't know how long it was going to last. But what they did know is that God said it has an expiration date. And if we're going to be patient with our exiles, then we need to have our focus on God's promise, not on our calendar. And it'll help us be patient. Because here's the thing, girls. There is a promise of exile. And that's what Jeremiah 29:11 really is. It is the promise of exile. I mean, for you and me, we might think it's a great verse to tweet. Or we might call it our life verse, right? But for the Jews, it was their lifeline. Because they clung to that promise in exile when God said to them, I know the plans I have for you. And they are good ones. They are not to harm you. They are not for calamity, but they are to give you a hope and a future. That's the promise of exile. But sometimes you don't get to that hope and to that future until you go through the exile. In 1992, on the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there was this huge container ship. It weighed 28,000 tons. And a great storm erupted in the Pacific Ocean, and this huge cargo ship was being tossed around like a little tugboat in a jacuzzi. I mean, these waves were as big as houses. Well, because the boat was rocked back and forth, some containers fell off of the boat. And these containers, they held some little yellow duckies and some turtles and some frogs, and they were all broken open, and the little colorful flotilla was dispersed into the Pacific Ocean. There were 30,000 of these little bath toys. Well, 10,000 of them, they headed south, and they ended up landing just a couple months later on a beautiful shore. But the rest of them, they went north. And it took them year after year after year to finally ride all these waves. They went through the Arctic Ocean. They were frozen into little colorful ice cubes as they bobbed and weaved their way through the Arctic Ocean. They went through Greenland and then down the whole eastern seaboard until finally, almost 20 years later, those little yellow duckies landed on the shore of Great Britain. And they were faded, and they were worn, and they were torn, and they looked like that experience had taken its toll. They looked a lot like you and I feel when we've been through exile. We don't know where the current of God's will and His plan is going to take us. But we know that He has promised that His plans for us are to give us a hope and a future. And that might mean that sometimes there are storms. And it might mean that sometimes the waves are so high that you don't think you're going to make it. But that's when you can take courage, because you know that God's plans for you are not for your calamity, but they are for your good. And therefore you ride the waves. You go with the flow. Because eventually, exile will end. And you will find yourself in the very place that God intended you to be. Here's the thing. Exile will not last forever. But God's faithfulness will. And all the sisters said,